What comes first, our devotion to the gods or obedience to the state? For much of Roman history, it would have been impossible to even ask this question. The worship of the supreme deities was so closely interwoven with loyalty to the Republic and later Empire that the two were indistinguishable. Indeed, throughout its entire pagan history, Rome showed no inclinations toward the modern idea that religious and state functions should be separated. Even intellectuals like Cicero, who displayed a degree of skepticism toward the official myths that underlined public rituals, would all adamantly insist that it was of the utmost importance that these rituals continue to take place exactly as they had for untold generations. While the idea of separating the city of God and the earthly city would not appear until St. Augustine at the very end of the Roman era, cracks in the unified facade surfaced during the political chaos of the late Republic in the most unlikely of places. A young patrician of no particular distinction risked his life to defy the might of the Roman state and the bloodthirsty warlord Lucius Cornelius Sulla Felix, claiming that orders from the reactionary dictator to divorce his wife ran counter to hallowed religious commitments and were thus invalid. That young man was a 20-year-old Gaius Julius Caesar, and he would take the first of his many gambles with fortune when he publicly defied the oligarchic dictator whose death squads had already killed thousands of political enemies. But why was a man who had Rome in the palm of his hand so concerned with two young patrician lovebirds? Sulla sought to end the relationship because Caesar's aunt was the wife of Gaius Marius, a popular hero whose forces had led the opposition to Sulla. And Caesar's wife, Cornelia, was the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, Marius's right-hand man. The two were wed when Marian partisans controlled the city, and these radical forces were at the height of their power, before Sulla began his march back to Rome from his wars of conquest in the Far East. The wedding can be read as a sign of Marius's belief in the vast potential of the young Caesar to one day rise to political prominence, as Marius would also select Caesar as the high priest of Jupiter, an immensely prestigious post and an untold honor for a man so young. But alas, this vision of a populari-driven future would not come to pass, as Marius died soon after the beginning of his 7th consulship, and Sulla eventually mobilized the forces of reaction to crush the upstart populari movement, as well as the Latin allies that were closely tied to it. The proscriptions he initiated cut a bloody swath through Rome that left few untouched, as thousands of senators, equestrians, and politically active commoners found themselves stripped of all legal protection. These unfortunates were to be killed on sight, with their murderers receiving a share of the condemned man's property. Anyone who helped the proscribed in any way by offering either food or shelter was to be added to the list. It goes without saying that many of those condemned found themselves on the proscription list simply because they were wealthy and others coveted their property. See our previous video on the case of Sextus Roscius for more information on those that were proscribed, despite the fact that they had never openly opposed Sulla. Sulla's proscriptions were bloody affairs, but he didn't engage in this despotism out of sheer bloodlust. To the contrary, there was a pragmatic political dimension to his purges. By uprooting everyone associated with the Populari faction and leaving their descendants not just penniless, but also legally ineligible to hold office, Sulla sought to crush the power of Rome's urban poor to influence the affairs of state. The proscriptions may have devolved into a murder-for-profit headhunting scheme rather quickly, but those initially targeted were Sulla's political enemies, and all of these men either died or fled into exile to join the rogue Roman general Sertorius, who was fighting a guerrilla war in Spain as the last Marian holdout. We must remember that the proscriptions were accompanied by reactionary political reforms that codified rule by an elite senatorial oligarchy and stripped the poor of hard-won political rights. Changes included severe legal limitations on the ability of the tribunes of the plebs to influence politics, as well as the eradication of the grain dole, a precursor to modern welfare programs that was essential to life for the urban poor. These efforts to remake the state also included intrusions into the private lives of leading Roman families and the dissolution of marriages as Sulla saw fit. Caesar and Cornelia were not singled out by the dictator. They were nowhere near prominent enough to deserve such a distinction. In fact, Sulla even ordered men who had fought alongside him to divorce their wives and marry women that he selected. For example, Pompey had been one of Sulla's most effective generals, but he quickly abandoned his wife Anticita when ordered to marry Sulla's stepdaughter Aemilia. Pompey was one of many men who assented to Sulla's highly unorthodox interference in their own personal lives, a testament to the fact that in spite of their past actions on his behalf, or even their own wealth and prestige, no one really felt safe from Sulla's ever-expanding proscription list. Sulla, then, must have been utterly shocked when Caesar openly defied him. But instead of instantly marking the young man for death, Sulla first stripped him of his appointment as high priest of Jupiter. When Caesar refused to relent, he confiscated Cornelia's dowry. Finally, Sulla threatened his family inheritances. After this too failed to convince Caesar to bend to the dictator's will, he was added to the proscription lists. All the while, Caesar never ceased to question the legitimacy of Sulla's orders. For what man should be permitted to break a bond that had been consecrated by the gods themselves? Caesar was able to embrace a religious pretext for defying Sulla's order to divorce his wife Cornelia because their marriage was no ordinary Roman marriage. Caesar and Cornelia had been wed in the highly ritualized conferatio ceremony that was only available to patrician families and was impossible to dissolve apart from the deaths of one of the spouses. The wedding, then, was more the religious binding of two ancient houses than it was the legal union of two discrete individuals. At least publicly, Caesar's defiance was predicated on the contention that the Julii and Cornelii clans had made an irrevocable pact before Jupiter himself, and that to dissolve their marriage would be an affront to the gods which kept Rome safe. At a time when Sulla exercised absolute and unquestioned power over all aspects of Roman life, Caesar had enlisted the gods themselves onto his side. With all of the Marian partisans dead or in exile, Caesar's outstanding political acumen had allowed him to find the only allies that Sulla could never kill. But Sulla was not used to defiance of any sort, and was certainly not going to allow an arrogant young patrician with no public standing pretend that he was the mouthpiece of Rome's gods, much less to introduce the idea that any of his policies could run counter to the divinely sanctioned order. Sulla had Caesar added to the proscription list for this public opposition to his regime, lest the young aristocrat inspire others to speak up against the dictator's campaign to remake the Roman state and remove the power of the commons to impact public policy. But Caesar was one step ahead and fled the city before officially becoming an outlaw. Suetonius and Plutarch tell us that he was forced to move from house to house on a daily basis with only a small entourage of loyal slaves. Apparently, Caesar was also quite ill throughout his entire stint as a fugitive, lending more dramatic flair to the episode and making his continued defiance of Sulla all the more impressive. Our sources relay that he was even apprehended once by a Sullan patrol and only escaped their clutches after paying a handsome bribe to the headhunters.
Then, as he was changing his abode by night on account of sickness, he fell in with soldiers of Sulla who were searching those regions and arresting the men in hiding there. Caesar gave their leader, Cornelius, 2 talents to set him free, and at once went down to the sea and sailed to King Nicomedes in Bithynia.
Throughout Caesar's entire spell as a fugitive, friends and family, as well as the Vestal Virgins themselves, never ceased to lobby Sulla on his behalf, telling the dictator that he was simply an arrogant young man who was smitten with love for the mother of his only child. Again and again, they relayed that this insignificant young aristocrat simply wasn't worth the trouble. Eventually, Sulla relented, perhaps agreeing with their assessment that Caesar truly posed no threat, or perhaps realizing that there was no need to antagonize the powerful Aurelian clan of Caesar's mother simply to end one little marriage. Or perhaps he was actually sympathetic to Caesar's case that a marriage confirmed by the rite of conferatio could not be ended by mere mortals, and decided to avoid the possibility of provoking divine anger by arranging Caesar's murder. After all, everyone else in the capital had followed his orders in lockstep. How much trouble could this boy really cause? Against all odds, Caesar had triumphed. With no trump cards to play, Caesar had stared down the most powerful man in Rome, and it was the dictator Sulla who ended up blinking. A man who had no qualms about bathing the streets of Rome in the blood of his enemies had allowed precisely one man to defy him and keep his head. It's astounding that this ended up working out for Caesar, and even if he had dropped off the pages of history immediately after, the story would still be worth telling. But this was not the last time that Caesar gambled with his life, or indeed the lives of others. Throughout his life, Caesar showed remarkable boldness and a willingness to take chances, no matter the odds. Things almost always broke his way. That is, at least until the Ides of March. But even there, Caesar's larger-than-life character transformed his assassination into one of the central cultural and historical touchstones of Western history. With his ascension to godhood soon after, even in death, Caesar could be said to have had the last laugh. Sulla famously gave himself the cognomen Felix, meaning fortunate or lucky, in recognition of the peculiar favor he enjoyed from the gods. But in reality, it was his young adversary, Caesar, who was the luckier of the two. The fact that we know the conclusion of the story in advance makes it more difficult for us to account for the boldness and sheer unexpectedness of Caesar's decision. We know that it all worked out for him in the end, but he couldn't have possibly known that. He was willing to spend months on the run, moving like a vagabond from house to house, rather than divorce his wife. For those of us familiar with Caesar's womanizing ways, much less his razor-sharp political instincts, it's hard to imagine that he was so madly in love with Cornelia that this risky decision was motivated entirely by sentiment. Was it religion, then, that caused him to abide by oaths made before the gods themselves? Perhaps, but Caesar, at least later in life, seems to have taken a non-traditional view of the gods, heavily influenced by Epicurean philosophy, one that would have precluded their personal involvement in the affairs of men. Politics, then, remains a distinct possibility, as he sought to oppose the dictatorship by aligning himself with the gods of Rome and casting Sulla as the one who was breaking faith with Rome's divine benefactors. But if political advancement was his ultimate aim, then surely would it not have been easier to just go along with Sulla's orders and divorce his wife, and take one favored by the new regime, as so many others had done? As a romantic myself, I'm inclined to believe that Caesar was really in love with Cornelia, and he refused to abandon her to the life of perpetual loneliness that Sulla had in store for her. He would have recognized the cruelty of this fate, and the effect that depriving her of their daughter, Julia, would have had on both Cornelia and the young Julia. He was certainly having affairs at this point, but what Roman man wasn't? Affection and monogamy were not as closely tied in the Roman mind as they are today. But maybe it was devotion to the gods as well. Though perhaps more skeptical than most, Caesar was certainly no atheist in the modern sense, and would have recognized that supernatural forces, beyond the comprehension of man, existed and shaped the world he inhabited. Like Sulla, he would have thought it best not to provoke such beings. Finally, Caesar's astute political instincts may have allowed him to sense that Sulla's dictatorship would be short-lived, and that with so many Marian allies dead and their sons barred from political careers, the road to immediate prominence as a populare standard-bearer was open to him if he managed to ride out the dictatorship without compromising with it. What better way to show his independence than to defy Sulla on religious grounds, instead of openly challenging him on contentious matters such as the Proscriptions or tribunician rights? The stakes were much lower in the religious realm than the material one, and it was also possible to cast himself as the real defender of tradition, propriety, and morality, snatching this label away from Sulla in the process. Further support for the idea that Caesar was playing the political long game can be found in the fact that the opportunity existed for him to join the armed resistance against Sulla's regime led by Sertorius in Spain, but he never took it. Nor did he join Lepidus's uprising against the conservative order in Italy soon after Sulla's death. Every last vestige of Sulla's reign would eventually be eradicated, but Caesar knew this would be accomplished in the forum and not on the battlefield. I want to stress that all of the reasons outlined above are simply my best guesses for things that may have been going on in Caesar's mind when he decided to defy Sulla. We don't know the exact rationale for the decision, and we never will. But just as perplexing to me is Sulla's decision to rescind his order that Caesar and Cornelia divorce. Allowing someone to get the better of him seems just as out of character for Sulla as it does for Caesar. Yet it was the man holding all the cards who ultimately folded. Past historians found Sulla's surrender just as surprising and explained it away by inventing one of the most remarkable quotes in Roman history, which is worth relaying here, even though it is almost certainly a fabrication.
Everyone knows that when Sulla had long held out against the most devoted and eminent men of his party who interceded for Caesar, and they obstinately persisted, he at last gave way and cried, either by divine inspiration or a shrewd forecast, "Have your way and take him. Only bear in mind that the man you are so eager to save will one day deal the death blow to the cause of the aristocracy, which you have joined with me in upholding. For in this Caesar there is more than one Marius."
The prophecy came true, likely because it was written after the fact, but in allowing Caesar to survive, Sulla had made a critical error. Looking back with our limited sources, we are powerless to guess the true reasons for Caesar's boldness. Perhaps he really was just a stubborn youth who was unwilling to submit to a man he detested, one that had been the death of his cousin Gaius Marius the Younger and so many friends in the Populare faction. The command to divorce could have just been the straw that broke the camel's back, and the proud aristocrat refused to yield another inch to the man that was trampling Roman liberty and destroying the institutions that made the Republic great. We'll never know what exactly was going on in Caesar's head, and that can serve as a potent reminder that as we study history, we must bear in mind that we are dealing with real humans of flesh and blood, beings that had hopes and fears, souls capable of reason and irrationality alike. Humans, in other words. Humans just like us.
Hi, this is Titus from Tribunet. If you enjoyed the video you just saw by Gaius, and if you're interested in thoughtful content that explores the complex culture of the ancient Romans, don't forget to hit like and subscribe.